from both Democrats and Republicans alike, experts in the field, to talk about how we craft tax policies that are going to carry us through the next decade.
Another minute.
This is such an important issue, Madam Speaker. This is about the future of America. This is about how we move forward. Now, you know, Ways and Means had 20 committee hearings already on this issue. One of my favorites was the fair tax. And that's what we're talking about as we move forward, having the ability for the American people to hear debate on this floor in committee sessions through the open process in which we can amend laws or legislation that's going to come forward to this House and get input from all of us, Democrats and Republicans alike. Because it really is about where are we heading as a nation? And we talk about job creation. This is about job creation. This is about sustaining the current jobs that we have and about allowing American businesses and entrepreneurs to create more jobs. It's not some crazy idea. This is real America. These are businesses in my district. And with that, Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from New York.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The real issue here today is, are we going to continue something that we know utterly failed? More than 10 years ago, this deal was made with corporations that we would cut the tax rate, they would produce jobs. We didn't get the jobs. Half of it didn't work. Why would a country as intelligent as ours want to continue that failed policy? We are at a critical crossroads here, and we'd better this time get it right. And in that regard, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, member of the Committee on Ways and Means.
I appreciate the gentlelady's courtesy, and she had it exactly right. We've gone down this path. We had an opportunity for us to see how effective the Bush tax cuts were in creating employment in America versus those high rates in the Clinton era, a couple of percentage points higher. Look at the job creation. 22 million jobs in the Clinton years when we were actually balancing the budget for 4 years in a row, reducing the deficit, versus an anemic job creation in the Bush administration that was less than 5% of that. We've tried it. With all due respect, it's really hard to characterize what happened in 2010 as bipartisan legislation. The Republicans in the Senate refused to legislate. It was going to be all the tax relief expire, and a consensus was made. Compromise was made to extend it. Hopefully we could work things out. Well, we didn't. We're right back in the same spot. I would respectfully suggest that what we are looking at now with my Republican colleagues, when they talk about the largest tax increase in American history, put the Republican Romney bill in effect. If you're going to have that massive cut for the wealthiest of Americans, the only way you can make that deficit neutral is by raising taxes on the other 95%. And you can quibble with some of the assumptions of the various independent experts, but they all agree if you're going to give people who make over $1 million on average more than $100,000 annual relief, you're going to be raising taxes on the people who make the 95% of the rest of America. That's not right. It's not necessary. There are better alternatives, and you're going to hear it in the form of the Democratic alternative that's going to come forth later this afternoon.
Gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia and my colleague on the Rules Committee, Mr. Rob Woodall.
Gentleman from Georgia, recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, say to my colleague from South Carolina, for yielding me the time. You know, I don't actually have the words for this debate, so I had to bring some with me, Madam Speaker. And what I brought are the very words that President Obama spoke from right here behind me in his State of the Union address in 2011. As you remember, we just done this thing that we all agreed on, and by we, my colleague from South Carolina and I were not in Congress at the time, but you, this thing that you agreed on with the President and with the Senate to not raise taxes on job creators. Why did you agree on that? Let's look to see what the President said. He said, we measure progress of the success of our people. We measure progress by the success of our people, by the jobs they can find and the quality of the jobs they can find. Opportunities for a better life that we pass on to our children, that's a project the American people want us to work on. Together, we did that in December, he says. Talking about when we came together to prevent the largest tax increase in American history from impacting Americans and the jobs they're seeking. Here's what he said. We did that in December. Thanks to the tax cuts that we passed, Americans' paychecks are bigger today. Businesses can write off the full cost of investments. And these steps taken by Democrats and Republicans will grow the economy and add more than 1 million private sector jobs. That's why Ernst & Young says doing what the Democrats propose to do is going to kill 700,000 jobs. Because as the President said, doing what we all agreed on, doing what we're proposing to do here today, added 1 million jobs. That's the President's address in 2011. He went on. He talked about the parade of lobbyists that have rigged the tax code to benefit particular companies and industries. He says, those with accountants and lawyers can work the system and pay no taxes at all, but the rest are hit with one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world. It makes no sense, he says, and it has to change. He's right. He's right, but the proposal that my friends on the Democratic side are bringing to the floor raises taxes on these small businesses that create jobs. The President knows that's not fair. He goes on. He says, tonight I'm asking Democrats and Republicans to simplify the system, get rid of the loopholes, he says, level the playing field, he says, and use the savings to lower the corporate tax rate for the first time in 25 years without adding to the deficit. That's what the President called on us all to do. That's what this rule that my friend from South Carolina allows us to do. And that's what, if we are willing to put politics aside in this election year, we can do together as you did in 2010. Madam Speaker, I'll close with this. That was his 2011 address, and maybe you think that was just the enthusiasm of our cooperation there at the end of 2010, but it wasn't. Standing right here in this chamber, 10 feet behind me this year.
Nice for 30 seconds.
I thank my friend. 10 feet behind me this year, the President said this. We have an opportunity at this moment to bring manufacturing back, but we have to seize it. We should start with our tax code, he says. Right now, companies get tax breaks for moving jobs and profits overseas. Meanwhile, companies that choose to stay in America get hit with one of the highest tax rates in the world. It makes no sense. Everyone knows it, so let's change it. What you do does not change it. What you do dooms our small business owners to continue to operate at one of the highest tax rates in the world. We can do better. We have the bill to do better. Together, we will do better. I thank my friend from South Carolina.
Gentlelady from New York.
I think I must say that 97% of small business in America will not be affected at all. I am pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Andrews.
I thank my
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes. Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my friend for yielding. Americans who served on the school board or a parish council or the board of trustees, their fire company, that have ever had a dispute about what to do, know that one of the ways to resolve the dispute is to say, well, listen, let's take the things that we agree on and do them, and set aside the things in which we disagree and argue about them later. But let's agree on the things we can do and get them done. I think virtually every member of this chamber agrees that if a family makes less than $250,000 a year, their taxes should not go up. Let's pass a bill that says that, and then move on to the things on which we disagree. Here is one of the things that we disagree on. The majority's bill that's on the floor raises taxes on 25 million Americans, and there are some of the Americans who least merit and deserve a tax increase. For example, an E4 corporal in the Marine Corps with 4 years of service, married with 2 children, sees his taxes go up by $448 a year under the Republican bill. Under the Democratic bill, that Marine's taxes do not go up. A military police sergeant, an E5 in the Air Force, 8 years of service, with a spouse and 3 young children, would see a tax increase of $1,118 a year. Now, how could this be? In 2009, President Obama increased the Earned Income Tax Credit, which helps low-income people who work for a living, and he increased the Child Care Credit, which is working people with children. We pay our Marines and our Air Force, our Army, our sailors a lot less than we should. They're very underpaid, and they take advantage of these tax breaks. These tax breaks, I would ask the lady for 30 more seconds.
I'll be happy to yield 30 more seconds.
Gentleman's recognized.
The Democratic bill preserves these tax rules for working families, including members of the military. The Republican bill does not. So I would urge my friends on both sides of the aisle to do the following. Let's oppose the rule that's on the floor, which gives us a chance to then amend the bill. And when we amend the bill, let's cancel out the tax increase on the Air Force sergeant of $1,118, and let's cancel out the tax increase on the Marine corporal of $448. Vote no. I yield back.
Gentleman from South Carolina.
We reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from New York.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the record just referred to by Mr. Andrews into the record at the proper spot.
Without objection.
Thank you, and now I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch.
I thank the gentlelady.
Gentleman from Vermont recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Let's first of all define what these 2 bills are. Number 1, the Democratic bill would provide tax relief to 100% of Americans. 98% would get tax relief on every dollar of income. 2% would get tax relief on up to $250,000 of income, and above that, they would be going back to the Clinton rates. The Republican bill would provide 100% of Americans' tax relief, including those top 2%. And at what cost? $1 trillion added to the debt, number 1. And number 2, higher taxes on military folks and low-income folks who would be hammered by the tax increases in the Republican bill. Why is that? Well, there's 2 reasons. 1, the underlying philosophy behind the Republican bill is the trickle-down economics work. It is a proposition that says the tax cuts that go to the 2%, the highest income Americans, who don't need them, will benefit 98% of Americans who don't get them. There's absolutely no evidence to back that up. Secondly, there's a total doubling down on supply-side economics, trickle-down economics. Our bill basically has 2 propositions. Number 1, if we're going to work ourselves out of the biggest recession that we've had since the Great Depression, we have to increase employment and we have to increase demand. And that's why we've got to give purchasing power to the vast majority of low-income and middle Americans. And that's why we sustain the tax breaks that we've had in place since the Bush tax cuts were passed. Number 2, we have to pay down on the debt and have money to invest in things like infrastructure, science, and education. That's $1 trillion that would be made available by going with the Democratic approach. So we've been here before. Trickle-down economics versus middle-class commitment. I yield back.
Gentleman from South Carolina.
Madam Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Renee Elmers.
Gentlelady from North Carolina recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague to speak on this very important issue today. I rise today in support of H.R. 8, which will ensure that we will not raise taxes on our nation's job creators and harm our recovery. Madam Speaker, I would like to speak about one sector of the economy that will be the greatest harmed, and that is our farmers. Our farmers provide for our nation and deserve our gratitude and protection from unnecessary harm. In my district, thousands of farmers and their families wait in fear that their homes and businesses will be destroyed by the devastating tax increases on the horizon. And yes, I am including the inheritance tax or the estate tax, or which I like to refer to as the death tax, which I think all in all needs to be repealed in full. But let's just talk today about what will happen if we do not pass H.R. 8. Our farmers will be forced to lay off workers. They will be forced to sell off equipment and land because that is where their investment is. And they will not be able to pass along to their families the accomplishments that they and their ancestors put forward, because most farms are family-owned businesses. What I am speaking of is the inheritance tax going up. It will increase to total asset income $1 million, increase to 55%, currently at $5 million at 35%. You can see that that would be devastating. As Steve Mitchell of Mitchell Farms in my district noted, and I quote, "It will be very hard for our son to carry on. We have paid taxes all our lives, and now they want to tax us when we die. With the value of our farm equipment these days, it wouldn't take long for a family farm to run up against this limit." We are here today because our economy and job creators continue to wait anxiously for real solutions. H.R. 8 will ensure that our family farmers, job creators, will be protected. Thank you, Madam, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The Chair will receive a message. The gentlelady will suspend. The Chair will receive a message.
Madam Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Madam Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has agreed to H.Con.Res 55, directing the Clerk of the House of Representatives to make a correction in the enrollment of H.R. 1627, in which the concurrence of the House is requested.
Gentlelady from New York.
Madam Speaker, I please yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
Gentleman from New York, recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my New York colleague and friend, and Madam Speaker, I rise today in strong opposition to H.R. 8, which should be more appropriately named the Job Prevention and Recession Protection Act. We always hear talk about tax reform, but the only solution my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have to offer is an extension of the failed policies that skyrocketed the debt and contributed to this current state of the economy. My Republican colleagues say their plan will create jobs. If that's true, why didn't it work during the Bush administration when we lost millions of jobs? The Republican philosophy always seems to be to help the wealthy and give the back of their hand to the middle class. So let's put this in perspective. At the same time the majority demands we give the wealthiest a break, they cut Medicaid and Medicare, early education programs, Title X family planning, and food stamps, and the list goes on and on. Madam Speaker, I'd laugh if this wasn't so tragic. Our government should be about giving everyone a fair chance and making sure that we help the middle class and working people. But unfortunately, the current Republican philosophy seems to make it easier for those who are already ahead and more difficult for everyone else. The Republican proposal would give our military soldiers a tax increase while giving millionaires and billionaires a huge tax break. That's why I strongly support the Democratic substitute introduced by Congressman Levin. Our substitute is in stark contrast to the billion-dollar boondoggle proposed by the majority. Our proposal continues the tax cuts for the middle class and requires the wealthiest to pay their fair share, as well they should. Until we can have a meaningful debate about actual tax reform, the Democratic proposal is the only one worth supporting. Madam Speaker, I urge my colleagues to oppose H.R. 8 and to support the Democratic substitute. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from South Carolina.
Madam Speaker, we reserve our time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from New York.
May I inquire? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize this was here. I beg your pardon. 2 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Gentleman from Tennessee, recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This week there was some disturbing news about members of the House. One of our finest, longest-serving members, Mr. LaTourette of Ohio, a Republican, announced he wasn't going to run for re-election. He said he couldn't run for re-election because of the gridlock and the difficulty getting things done. He was for income, revenue, not for Grover Norquist's pledge that most of the Republicans have signed. And because he was for revenue, which is what the Democrat plan is in taxing the wealthiest and most blessed financially in this country, he gave up because he said you couldn't get things done. That's a shame. People ask, why is there partisan gridlock? This is a perfect example. The two sides agree that people making $200,000 a year, or married couples $250,000, should get continued tax breaks. We should pass that as the Senate did. We know that can become law and guarantee those tax breaks. The difference that we have is whether people making over $200,000 single and $250,000 married get tax breaks. They will get tax breaks on that amount of income, but not on the income over that. I've been blessed in my life, and I've had sufficient monies to do the things I want. But I've never made $250,000 a year. I consider that a lot of money. On the Democratic side, we call that middle-class tax cuts. The reality is, in my perspective, it's upper middle-class tax cuts and middle-class tax cuts. The only people at the top who are having to pay a little more are the very wealthy and predominantly millionaires. When I grew up, millionaires was somebody who had a net worth of $1 million. Today it's somebody who makes $1 million. Rock stars, business tycoons, bankers. They can afford to pay it. They're not spending that money. We need Americans who spend their money to stimulate our economy. We need purchasers. So that's why I'm against the Republican plan. For the Democratic plan, it will activate our economy. I yield back the balance of my time and thank the lady for the time she's extended.
And the chair will advise the gentleman from South Carolina that he has 7.5 minutes remaining, and the gentlelady from New York has 9.5 minutes remaining. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Kansas, Ms. Lynn Jenkins.
Gentlelady from Kansas, recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, stopping the tax hike is not just about taxes, it's about jobs. Small businesses have been responsible for about 2/3 of the new jobs created. Raising taxes on the so-called rich will hit nearly 1 million of these businesses, and in this weak economy will risk destroying 700,000 jobs. Is it worth it? Raising taxes simply allows Washington to spend more. If we want to have a serious discussion about reining in our out-of-control spending, I welcome that debate. But first, we should do no harm to our fragile economy. Extending current rates gives us time to pass our plan for comprehensive tax reform without risking thousands of jobs in another recession. CBO estimates this action will produce 2 million jobs next year alone. The choice is clear. Let's stop the tax hikes and create jobs. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentlelady from New York.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlelady from Texas for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, although I have great affection for the gentleman from South Carolina, I am so enthusiastic that Ranking Member Slaughter is managing this bill. I rise in great opposition to H.R. 8, but enthusiastic support for H.R. 15. This is a gift to America's women, working women, mothers, and let me give you the role. Every taxpayer will get tax relief on $250,000. That, by the evidence of this letter from small businesses, will be 98% of small businesses, and they are women, most of them, many of them. Women who are in their homes having a 1-person small business. Women who have hired people in a 5-person small business. Women who are thinking of getting ready to start their small businesses. Then, of course, the child tax credit. What a boon for working mothers and others who need that desperate relief. And then, of course, the marriage tax relief. EITC, if you come from the Gulf region, we were saved by the Earned Income Tax Credit for Hurricane Katrina victims. They were able to get some minimal relief to carry them through. The Higher Education Tax Credit, the Adoption Tax Credit, and as I indicated, the Child Care Tax Credit. Tax credit as well for expensing in small businesses. What are my colleagues and my friends on the other side talking about? A job-killing, economy-killing, deficit-busting H.R. 8 is not the way to go. And so I am enthusiastically here to tell the women of America that this is a vote for you today. Those women who get up every day, who design a way to make a living when there is no job. These women, along with men who have come into understanding what small business can do to America. I'm excited because the 18th Congressional District I consider a host of small businesses. Everywhere I go, individuals are talking about their small businesses. 10 seconds. And 10 seconds.
Yes. Gentlelady is recognized for an additional 10 seconds.
I thank you very much. I want to submit into the record, Madam Chair, a letter of small businesses from the Main Street Alliance opposing H.R. 8 and supporting this legislation the Democrats are offering. This is a celebration for women. This vote today will enhance opportunities for women, small businesses, and families across America. I yield back.
Expired. The gentleman from South Carolina.
Madam Speaker, I yield 2.5 minutes to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Steve King.
Gentleman from Iowa for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentleman from South Carolina for yielding and for leading this debate on the reform debate for real tax reform. And the time I came to this Congress, I made the pledge that I would push for tax reform. I believed at the time that the debate that had been taking place in this Congress over the preceding years would flow into the following years. I remember the inspiration that came when Billy Tozan and Dick Armey went around the country and debated tax reform between the flat tax and the fair tax. I don't remember ever anyone that debating in favor of the fair tax having lost that debate, but we had real tax reform debate. And in this time, and I've pushed in my time in this Congress, I can think of only one time that we've had a serious debate on tax reform. And that was a time that we had some debate, and I testified before the Ways and Means Committee in favor of a national sales tax. This rule that's before us expedites this debate. It expedites the consideration of a bill providing for comprehensive tax reform. And I look at the conditions that are in here. There are 5 conditions that are written in, and the fair tax meets all of those conditions, I think, by design. I'm looking forward to an open debate that will take place at least within the Ways and Means Committee and hopefully coming here to the floor. It says to me, as I look at this rule, that the legitimate proposals that would come for real tax reform will be in order before the Ways and Means Committee. So I encourage those committee members, as this expedited debate takes place, bring your reforms to the Ways and Means Committee, bring them in forms of amendment. Let's have a real debate. Let's put the fair tax up against everything else. And I have done that now since about 1980. And even though I've lost a couple of debates with my wife and some with my family and even 1 or 2 with my staff, I've never lost a debate on the fair tax because the American people understand this. Right now, the federal government has a first lien on all productivity in America. If you punch a time clock on Monday morning, just imagine Uncle Sam is standing there by that time clock. When it goes thunk, his hand goes out, and he gets into his hand what he wants until he gets his share, and then he puts it in his pocket, and you get to keep what's left. Let's change the tax from production to consumption. Let America grow. Let America breathe, to quote the congressman from Pennsylvania, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentlelady from New York.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to inquire of my colleague if he has further speakers.
We have 1.
I'll reserve the balance, Madam.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from South Carolina.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Blake Farenthold.
Gentleman from Texas, recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I thank my freshman colleague from South Carolina. I rise today in support of this rule. America has waited long enough for the uncertainty over taxes to go away. This rule gives us the opportunity to avoid a huge tax increase and gives us the opportunity to have that debate about a fairer, flatter, simpler tax that the American people want and need and this economy wants and needs. You know, we shouldn't be having a big argument over these extensions. They passed on a bipartisan basis under Speaker Pelosi. They should pass under a bipartisan basis this time. We do not need the politics of envy and divisiveness. We need tax reform, and this puts us on the path to do it. I urge my colleagues to support this rule and the underlying bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from New York.
If my colleague has no further speakers, I'm prepared to close. Right.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We understand the majority intends to have a last-minute change in the rule. The amendment would create a number of obstacles to middle-class tax cuts. And under the last-minute change, the middle-class taxes could not be cut till the Senate has approved the entire Republican tax reform agenda. And we certainly don't need that kind of an obstacle, or we don't need that kind of bill. We need quick action on tax cuts, so I hope we can get that today. But let me remind you that you need to vote against this rule unless you want the Republican bill to pass automatically. Senate-passed tax cuts are simple and the fair extension of the tax cuts that will directly benefit the middle class. It was quite wonderful to see the Senate of the United States do the sensible thing and say that everyone with $250,000 and under would receive a tax cut. Unfortunately, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are the only ones standing in the way of the tax cut becoming law. Their flawed alternative proposal demands that any middle-class tax cut be accompanied by an additional tax cut for the richest 2%. Such a proposal would be and has been a fiscal disaster. It would explode the nation's deficit, fail to create jobs, and perpetuate the record of inequality that faces our nation. The oft-repeated premise that we need to protect the job creators who haven't created any jobs with lower corporate taxes and lower taxes for the wealthy should be put to bed. It has been thoroughly and convincingly disproven. Instead of protecting the tax loopholes for corporations that ship jobs overseas and serving the wealthy at the expense of the middle class, we should be making the tax code more simple and fair by asking everyone just to pay their fair share. Our proposed middle-class tax cut would be a great first step toward doing just that. In addition, Madam Speaker, if we defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to the rule to give the House a vote on H.Res. 746, which would prohibit us from going home until the President signs middle-class tax cuts into law. Otherwise, we will be going home perhaps tomorrow with that undone. There is no excuse for Congress to go on summer vacation at the end of this week. No other American leaves work with a job half done, and neither should we. It is our duty to deliver results for the American people, and we should not leave this town till every middle-class family has a tax cut in their hands. In closing, I urge my colleagues to support the middle tax cuts, to vote no on the rule on ordering the previous question, and I ask unanimous consent to put the amendment in the record with other extraneous material.
Objection.
I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady from New York yields back the balance of her time. The gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I wonder what my friend from Texas would have said if she was still here to the 253,000 women, small business owners, who will be impacted by higher taxes based on the actions of our friends on the left. I wonder, Madam Speaker, what my friends on the left would say to the 710,000 newly unemployed Americans because of their actions on the left. I wonder, Madam Speaker, what my friends on the left would say to the senior citizens who make less than $100,000, to the senior citizens who make less than $50,000, who would see a 185% increase on their taxes for their dividend income. Madam Speaker, my friends on the left asked a very interesting and telling question when they asked, who deserves a tax increase? Well, we on the right have a very clear answer to that question. We believe everybody deserves a tax decrease. Madam Speaker, with unemployment for the 41st month over 8%, with unemployment in South Carolina over 9.4%, I would suggest, Madam Speaker, now is not the time to engineer fairness. Now is the time for us to keep taxes low. Madam Speaker, everyone in this room can agree we need to take steps to turn our economy around. But while one side of the room wants to divide our nation to do so, we understand that punishing some Americans in the name of helping others is not the solution. We must lift everyone up. Otherwise, we will all just end up in the squishy, nebulous middle. And America isn't about being mediocre. America is about being the best, the strongest, and the leader of the free world. Let's stay there as a nation. Madam Speaker, I move to amend the resolution with the amendment I have placed at the desk.
Support the amendment.
Add the following new section, Section 10A. In the engrossment of H.R. 8, the clerk shall, 1, add the text of H.R. 6169 as passed by the House as new matter at the end of H.R. 8. 2, conform the title of H.R. 8 to reflect the addition of H.R. 6169 as passed by the House to the engrossment. 3, assign appropriate designations to provisions within the engrossment. And 4, conform provisions for short titles within the engrossment. B, upon the addition of the text of H.R. 6169 as passed by the House to the engrossment of H.R. 8, H.R. 6169 shall be laid on the table.
Gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The amendment instructs the clerk to add the text of H.R. 6169 as new matter at the end of H.R. 8 before transmitting the bill to the Senate. Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on the amendment and on the resolution.
Gentleman yields back his time, and the question is on the amendment and on ordering the previous question on the resolution. And those in favor will signify by saying aye. Opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Madam Speaker,
Gentlelady from New York.
I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested, and those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, the Chair will reduce to 5 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote on the question of adoption of the amendment, if ordered, and adoption of the resolution, if ordered. This will be a 15-minute vote. A 15-minute vote.
The so-called Bush tax cuts of 2001-2003 are set to expire on December 31st. The House this morning has been debating this afternoon the rule to a bill that would extend those tax cuts for another year. They're also going to allow a Democratic version under the rule to be considered, a version that's similar to the one passed in the Senate last week, which applies to incomes of $250,000 or less. This is a procedural vote. The previous question vote, the rule itself, if it passes, would allow for an hour of debate on the bill and consideration again of that Democratic alternative. As you may have seen on the screen throughout the rule debate so far, we're looking at the hashtag tax cuts. If you're on Twitter, twitter.com/cspan is where you'll find us. And if you're tweeting, you can use tax cuts as the hashtag, keeping an eye on some of those top cat conservative tweets. Can't wait until Ted Cruz joins the GOP Senate. They need people who won't cave in and take the nation hostage for tax cuts for the rich. Also, Don Millard tweeting, yeah, GOP leader, we've seen the decade of growth we've got from the Bush tax cuts, slowest job growth rate since World War II. A couple of the tweets using the hashtag tax cuts. And for further details on the tax bills today and the one coming up tomorrow, we spoke a short while ago to a Capitol Hill reporter. Tax reporter with Bloomberg BNA. What is this debate over extending tax cuts really all about?
What you're going to see today really is just largely a political vote so that members can go back and campaign on this. You're going to see the complete opposite of what happened last week in the Senate. Basically today the House is going to pass a Republican plan that would extend all of the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts for all taxpayers, and then you're going to see them defeat a Democratic plan that would extend the tax cuts for all taxpayers, but total tax cuts for 98% of the taxpayers, which basically means that they've set an income threshold. So for this would cover individuals' income up to $200,000 and married couples' income up to $250,000.
Was it a surprise at all that the House Republicans allowed the Democratic proposal, the one passed in the Senate, to be brought up in the House today?
No, not so much. You know, they really want these votes taken here. They're political votes. They want them to go back, be able to campaign and say, look, Democrats are willing to raise taxes on the upper income families. And, you know, Democrats also want to see these Republican votes because they want them to go back and say, look at this. Republicans are willing to cut taxes on the wealthy while letting taxes expire on the middle class. There's a bunch of things in that Republicans left out of their bill, like that would help, college students and the American Opportunity Tax credits, and some enhancements to the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit that Republicans did not include in their plan.
How many Republican votes is the Democratic proposal likely to attract, and likewise, how many Democratic votes is the Republican plan going to get?
I don't think you'll see any Republicans vote for the Democratic plan. You'll probably see just a handful, not very many, of politically imperiled Democrats vote for the Republican plan.
How much is that Republican plan going to cost?
The Republican plan would cost about $400 billion, while the Democratic plan would cost about $250 billion. They're not entirely accurate when you look at them. They're apples to oranges. The Republican plan does include a patch for the alternative minimum tax for 2 years, whereas the Democratic plan includes it for 1 year. The Republican plan addresses the estate tax, but the Democratic plan does not address it, and leaders have said that they would look to address that later on in the year.
Why do Republicans say it's important to extend the tax cuts for all income levels? Democrats are saying it's the $250,000 income level.
Republicans are saying, look at this weak economy, this poor economy. If you raise taxes on people, it's going to severely impact the small businesses who file their tax returns through the individual side of the tax code. Democrats say, if we spend this money on the upper 2% who make a significantly higher portion of money than a lot of, than the 98%, well, then you're going to imperil our ability to address these issues and long-term fiscal issues down the road.
Another tax bill coming up in the House on Thursday dealing with tax overhaul. What's the bill designed to do?
The bill basically sets the tone and the parameters for next year's tax reform debate. What Republicans hope to do with the extension of the tax cuts for 1 year through 2013 is use that as a bridge to get to tax reform. But what they've gone and done with this tax reform process bill that you'll see the vote on tomorrow is that they've included a bunch of standards that a tax reform bill to come to the floor would have to include. And some of those include moving to a territorial tax system from the current worldwide tax system for our businesses. It includes dropping the current tax rates down to 2 tax rates, and includes other things like setting the corporate tax rate at a maximum of 25%. That bill does not spell out how they're supposed to get there and what tax expenditures they'd have to eliminate from the code. Democrats don't support some of those things, and Democrats will say on the floor tomorrow that this bill is going to shut them out of the process and shut down deliberations in the House.
An update on the House tax bills from Heather Rothman, tax reporter with Bloomberg B&A. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And on the House floor, the first of 3 votes related to the tax cut extension legislation, 15-minute vote on the previous question. We are keeping our eye on Twitter this afternoon. The hashtag tax cuts. Isabel Cunningham tweeting, I don't know how many times we have to prove that, quote, trickle-down economics does not work. Tax cuts for the wealthy don't benefit anyone but the top 1%. And lots of folks also tweeting about President Obama speaking this afternoon on tax cuts. He's in Ohio for a couple of campaign appearances, finishing up earlier this afternoon in Mansfield. People tweeting about that. He will be in Akron, Ohio later this afternoon, 3:55 Eastern, and you can follow that live online at cspan.org. Well, as we mentioned, this is the first of 3 votes on the extension of the tax cuts. This is the previous question vote. Louise Slaughter asking Democrats to vote no on the previous question so that she can offer her amendment to the rule, which would ensure that the House can't leave for recess or adjourn until tax cuts are signed into law by the President. While this vote continues, we're going to bring you some of the debate on the rule itself from just a short while ago.
From South Carolina, recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my good friend and colleague, Tim Scott. And I was in rapt attention when he was talking. It was almost as if he stole my thoughts, but I don't mind because he's a member of the freshman class. And many of us in the freshman class, Madam Speaker, we weren't here in December of 2010. When this body last decided to extend the tax cuts for all Americans, not some of them, but all Americans, 18 months ago. So you can imagine, Madam Speaker, how intrigued we are by the debate on the other side. We're also intrigued at the number of our colleagues who not 18 months ago decided it would be bad economics to raise taxes on any American. Which leads me to wonder, were the rules not fair 18 months ago? I know that's the campaign slogan, that everybody has to play by the rules and everybody should pay their fair share. Were the rules not fair 18 months ago? Was everybody not paying their fair share 18 months ago? Because heavens knows they voted for it 18 months ago, which got me wondering, Madam Speaker, what's different today than it was 18 months ago? Well, maybe the economy's better off. Maybe that's the explanation. And then I saw, well, gas prices are higher and milk prices are higher and bread prices are higher and inflation is higher, which is the most insidious of all taxes, and people's purchasing power is down. So, no, that couldn't be why they changed their minds. It can't be because people are better off, because they're not. So then I thought, Madam Speaker, well, maybe it's because government has become a better steward of the tax dollars that we do give them. Maybe government's spending the money better. And then I thought, well, no, we've had Solyndra, and we've had Abound, and we've had a failed stimulus plan, and we've had a GSA scandal, so no, it couldn't possibly be that we're spending the money wiser. So why in the world, Madam Speaker, would so many of our colleagues who just 18 months ago thought the rules were just fine and that 35% was enough to pay, why in the world would they change their mind in the course of just 18 months? And then it dawned on me, Madam Speaker. It dawned on me while I was listening to the President tell our fellow Americans, you didn't build that, and promising more flexibility in a second term, that we're in the middle of a re-election campaign. It dawned on me, no, the economy's not better. And no, government's not spending its money better, but I have to have something to run on, so I'm going to pit one group of Americans against another group of Americans, because God knows I can't run on my record. So let's try the politics of bringing people down and perpetrating this myth that somehow pulling other people down makes me taller. Let's pit one group of Americans against another group. Madam Speaker, the economy is still struggling. Heavens knows it is. People are suffering. If you want economic growth, why in the world are you talking about taking more money from people? Even if you don't think they built it. Why are you what has changed in the last 18 months other than the vicissitudes of a political cycle, Madam Speaker? And then I got to thinking, while Congressman Scott was talking, let's assume for the sake of argument, Madam Speaker, that we do what they want us to do. Go ahead and raise it to 39%. It may be 39 this time. How about 50? If you didn't build it, how about take half of it? What about 60%, Madam Speaker? If you didn't build it, take 60% of it. Where does it stop? I know I'm out of time, so I'll say this if I could have 15 more seconds.
I'll extend them 1 minute.
Gentleman's recognized.
What the Democrats want to do, Madam Speaker, is bad citizenship, it is bad economics, it is bad for our fellow Americans. It remains to be seen if it's good electioneering or not. That remains to be seen. But duplicity is duplicity no matter what the calendar says. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from New York.
Madam Speaker, I am pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. DeLauro.
Gentlelady from Connecticut for 2 minutes.
I would just like to remind the previous speaker that 18 months ago, it was the Republican majority in this House that made a determination to bring this nation to its knees and to shut down the government because they would not raise a debt ceiling and were holding the government hostage and the nation hostage. And quite frankly, that's what they're doing again today. And this time, it is about tax relief for working families and for middle-class families. The duplicity is on the other side of the aisle, which always is trying to bring this body and this country to the precipice. I rise in opposition to the House majority's tax plan. What it would do is raise its taxes on 25 million middle-class and working families. People with incomes below $250,000, their taxes would go up by $1,000 each. Why? In order to give another tax break to the rich. The New York Times article said just a few days ago, the Republicans will press to extend tax cuts for affluent families scheduled to expire on January 1st. But the same Republican tax plan would allow a series of tax cuts for the working poor and for the middle class to end next year. Washington Post said, and I quote, Republicans want to raise taxes on the poor. Why? Why, indeed, in order to pay for an over $160,000 tax break for millionaires. The plan would slash the child tax credit, taking an average of $854 away from nearly 9 million families, pushing 2 million children back into poverty. It weakens the earned income tax credit, which kept 8.3. For the gentlelady yield another minute?
I yield another minute.
I thank
The lady is recognized for an additional minute.
It weakens the earned income tax credit, which kept 8.3 million people out of poverty last year. This as poverty rates head toward the highest levels in nearly half a century. We all know there's a better way forward. The Senate has passed a plan supported by the President, which cuts taxes for 98% of Americans, 97% of the small businesses in the country. Rather than holding tax relief for the vast majority of American families and small businesses hostage to more tax cuts for the wealthiest 2%. Let us take up that Senate bill. I urge my colleagues to vote against the rule and this Republican reverse Robin Hood tax plan and support tax relief for the middle class.
House debate from just a short while ago on the rule for the extension of the Bush-era tax cuts. The rule would allow for an hour of general debate, also consideration of the Democratic substitute amendment, the Democratic version similar to the one that the Senate passed last week. In the Senate it passed, and that applies to incomes of $250,000 or less. 3 votes here. This first one is the previous question, and then the vote on the amendment and the vote on the rule itself will follow that. This first one is a 15-minute vote. On Capitol Hill today, several hearings, including starting off this morning the House Armed Services Committee meeting to hear from Pentagon officials on the impact of the budget cuts that are mandated by sequestration, the automatic budget cuts set to go into effect on January 1st. We covered the hearing live this morning on C-SPAN, and here's a look at part of it from this morning now.
Recently, attention in Congress has focused on seeking information from the administration on planning and preparing for sequestration. I want to stress that in the very unfortunate event that Congress fails to pass a balanced deficit reduction package and avoid sequestration, the administration will indeed be prepared to issue the sequestration order on January 2nd and to manage its implementation. But let me be very clear. No amount of planning will mitigate the damaging effects of sequestration. Moreover, our planning must be deliberate so that we avoid inadvertently triggering some of the negative effects of sequestration. We do not want to waste scarce resources or disrupt critical government operations. To make this vivid, the right course is not to spend time moving around rocks at the bottom of the cliff to make for a less painful landing. The right course is to avoid driving off the cliff altogether. The implementation of sequestration would be governed by the procedures set forth in the law. And I want to emphasize that the law provides OMB and agencies with very little flexibility or discretion in implementing sequestration. There'd be a uniform percentage reduction at the account level, which would apply equally across programs, projects, and activities. Because Congress has not yet made progress towards enacting balanced deficit reduction, the administration is taking a number of actions to prepare for a possible sequestration. Earlier this week, OMB issued guidance to agencies and will engage them with agencies on matters necessary for issuing the sequestration order. I have also notified Congress of the President's intent to exercise his authority to exempt all military personnel accounts from sequestration if it were to occur. And regarding federal contractors, earlier this week the Department of Labor issued guidance on the WARN Act, clarifying that contractors are not required to issue WARN Act notices to their workers in advance of January 2nd, and that doing so would actually be inappropriate in light of the underlying purposes of the Act. So we are taking the necessary steps, but as I stated, no amount of planning will mitigate the damaging effects of sequestration. Sequestration is a blunt, indiscriminate instrument designed to force action, force Congress to act. It's August 1st. 5 months remain for Congress to work together to pass balanced deficit reduction and avoid the sequester. The administration stands ready to work with Congress to get the job done. Thank you, and I look forward to taking any questions.
Thank you. Dr. Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity to be here with you today. Pleased to join my colleague, Mr. Zients, and I'll focus, of course, on the impacts of sequestration on the operations of the Department of Defense. Let me begin, though, if I may, by thanking you all for your continuing support to our department and our service members and military families, not only in Afghanistan but everywhere around the world. It's much appreciated. I just returned on Friday from a 10-day trip around the Pacific theater, where I had the opportunity to meet with our troops stationed in Hawaii and Guam, the Republic of Korea, Japan. For over 70 years, the presence of our servicemen and women has been a critical guarantor of peace and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region. In the climate of peace and stability created by the U.S. military presence, first Japan rose and prospered, then South Korea, then Southeast Asia, and now China and India. We intend to remain a Pacific power for decades to come, because we believe this region is one where an important part of our future lies. Our new defense strategy calls for exactly that, and that is one of many reasons why the subject of this hearing is so important to all of us. Mr. Chairman, if it's acceptable to the committee, I'd like to ask that my full statement be submitted for the record, and I'll just continue with some.
No objections, so ordered.
Secretary Panetta and I have been emphasizing for many months that sequestration, if it's allowed to happen, would have a devastating effect on defense. While I'll focus on the impact on the Department of Defense, Acting Director Zients' testimony makes it clear that the effects on the operations of non-defense agencies would be equally devastating. He has already described the mechanics by which sequestration would work, and I would refer you to my prepared statement for a more detailed treatment of the mechanics of sequestration as they would apply particularly to the Department of Defense. I'll briefly highlight some of the impacts of sequestration that are specific to DoD, but much of what I say could be echoed by non-defense government managers and also by industry managers who furnish critical goods and services to the federal government. While I can describe many of sequestration's impacts on DoD, it's not possible to devise a plan to implement it that somehow eliminates these consequences or even mitigates them substantially. The intent of sequester was to use the threat of mutually agreeable cuts to both defense and non-defense programs implemented inflexibly and mindlessly to force Congress to enact a compromise deficit reduction plan. It was never designed to be implemented. Sequestration, therefore, if it were allowed to happen, would introduce senseless chaos into the management of every single one of more than 2,500 defense investment programs. Waste into defense spending at the very time we need to be especially careful with the taxpayer's dollar, inefficiency into the defense industry that supports us, and would cause lasting disruptions even if it only extended for 1 year. Sequestration in fiscal year 2013 would seriously disrupt our forces and our programs. Over the longer term, the lower spending caps in fiscal 2014 through fiscal 2021 would require that we substantially modify and scale back the new defense strategy that the DoD leadership, working under the guidance of the President, so carefully developed just a few months ago. If sequestration is triggered, its impacts would be, as I said, devastating for defense. Given the recent announcement that the President will exempt military personnel funding from sequestration, the cuts in the rest of DoD funding will be about 10%. Under sequestration rules, moreover, this same percentage cut must apply individually to literally thousands of defense programs, one by one. Overseas contingency operations, or OCO funding, would be subject to sequestration. That is, of course, wartime, war support funding. Supporting our warfighters in combat is obviously our highest priority. We would therefore endeavor to protect wartime operating budgets as much as possible, including the key operation and maintenance accounts. This is possible to do in part because the O&M accounts contain OCO as well as base budget funding. And these two categories of O&M funding merge together during execution of the DoD budget. We could therefore reduce the base budget portions of O&M disproportionately and spare the OCO portions. We could take similar steps as needed in other accounts that include OCO funding. However, especially in the Army and the Marine Corps, this action would lead to correspondingly much larger impact on base budget O&M and hence on readiness of those services. We would seek to minimize effects on readiness of units deploying in the near term, but we could probably not do so fully. As a result, some later deploying units, including some deploying to Afghanistan, could receive less training, again, especially in the Army and the Marine Corps. Under certain circumstances, reduced training could also impact the readiness of other units to respond to new contingencies, should they occur. Obviously, sequestration would also affect training in the other services, the Navy and the...
On this vote, the yeas are 240 and the nays are 183. The previous question is ordered. The question is on adoption of the amendment. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. Gentlelady from New York.
Madam Speaker, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise.